How you doing, Doc?
Hello, Rev. How are you?
Good to see you. Thanks for coming. How you doing? All right. Growing up here in Brooklyn, I was barely a teenager when I got actively involved in the first political campaign in my life. It was civil rights leader James Farmer, who had headed CORE, ran as a Republican. He ended up running against a fiery state legislator named Shirley Chisholm. And I ended up falling in love with Shirley Chisholm, at least politically. And Shirley Chisholm won the election, later ran for president in '72. I was one of her youth directors. So politics is something I literally grew up with. There has been the discussion for the last decade, do blacks need their own party? Are we too closely identified with the Democratic Party? Is the Republican Party a viable option? I know no one in America, black or white, that has talked more about independent party, particularly in an African-American context, than Dr. Lenora Fulani. And I know Dr. Fulani since both of us were teenagers. No, we were a little older than teenagers. Your view on this?
I think the issue isn't whether or not we need our own party. It's if we need to create new allies. And for years we've been in a relationship with liberals in the country, and I think that that has served its cause. It took us through the voting rights and civil rights movement. Our new allies are independent. We got 75,000 votes on the Independence Party line, and a third of the black vote voted independent, and more would have had we known that a candidate could run on more than one party.
All right, I'm gonna come back to that. Reverend, you are a Republican, and you've worked in the Bush White House, senior Bush White House. Given the latest dip in the polls your standard bearer has had, do you think that that has harmed efforts by people like you to get blacks?
I don't think so. I think that polls, of course, go up and down. I've always believed that we need to be involved in both of the major parties, the Republican as well as the Democratic Party. And the reason for that being that neither of the two major parties that exist should ever think that they can take our vote for granted. My son and I were walking in downtown New York, and a woman who happened to be white approached us, and she said, "Let me tell you about who we're running and why you all need to sign this thing." And then my son said, "So what party do you think you are?" And he says, "Well, you're Democrats, of course. You're black, you're Democrats." And my son was so offended by that, and I was too. I hope the day comes when nobody will ever suppose that because of the color of my skin, I am automatically one party or the other. I think it's just as important for black people to be Republicans and to change things from within and to make sure that the concerns of black people are heard as it is for black people to be Democrats. Just like you've made a huge impact on the Democratic side as a credible candidate for the presidency of the United States.
Well, it wasn't sponsored by the Democrats, but we'll get back to that. See, I'm civil in the first go-round, then we start acting. We take the razors out after that. We are the barbershop.
That's good.
Let's go.
Walter Mosley, noted author, and has written a lot about politics. Where do you fall in between Independent Party and Republican Party?
Being a writer, like I'm very worried about terms. So you have these two parties whose major constituency is money, and wealthy people give them, money, and there's a much different response to the person who gives $10 or their vote or whatever. And so there's the Democratic Interest Corporation, and there's the Republican Interest Corporation. If you have $1 million, either of these corporations are going to do for you. There should be a black interest group, not a black political party, because that would be marginalized, but a black interest group, which would not be marginalized. They say, listen, these are our interests. We have 8, major things is what we're going to do, and you got to do these things for us, otherwise we're not going to vote for you. In doing this, I think that we would cause a whole bunch of other interest groups, gay interest groups, real Republican interest groups, angry young white men interest groups, and even people who we might have a lot of conflict with. They would end up agreeing with us because all of our issues are pretty much in common as individuals in this country. People wanting health care, that kind of stuff.
Part of the tension in the 80s is how do you define an independence party? There were those that felt we should have it black only, and that if it was multiracial, it would not be any different than the other two parties. Isn't that the same as the blacks fighting for some leverage inside the Republican Party or the Democratic Party?
It isn't, because the Democratic and Republican parties are established. There is no room at the top. As Walter pointed out earlier, they're like corporations unto themselves. The independent movement is very fluid, it's very open, and if you're going to be involved in an effort to get political power, you have to fight. And that's what we are involved in.
So it's not just an automatic.
No,
even
you
in
have
an
to,
independent party,
nothing
you're going to have the same kind of internal struggles that you have in other parties.
Historically, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party of abolition and the anti-slavery. The Republican Party since then has been very anti-affirmative action, anti-civil rights, anti-inclusion.
I believe that there are a variety of reasons that blacks should be Republicans. The fastest growing businesses in our country are minority and women-owned businesses. Those that are not rich, but those that want to strive to be rich, would want a party that promotes low regulation, low taxation, and promotes entrepreneurship. It's the Republican Party that has elevated blacks to unprecedented positions of power. Not because they're black, but because of their qualifications. I don't believe that all blacks should be Republicans, just like I don't believe that all blacks should be Democrats.
We should be with a party that's going to be supportive of us.
Democrats pretty much take us for granted. They take out the racial bloody shirt every 4 years to get us riled up for a presidential election. Then they go away. The Republican Party writes us off, doesn't take us seriously as a constituency. That's a terrible position for the black community to be in, to be taken for granted by one party and to be written off by the other party. And that only comes because we monolithically, robotically give our vote to one political party as if we're still slaves.
Nigel Ennis said that Republicans have put us in unprecedented positions of power. Should blacks be proud of Condoleezza Rice being in charge of the war in Iraq?
Well, they should be proud of the fact that Condoleezza Rice was first the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, and then now is the second African-American Secretary of State, both named by a Republican president, Colin Powell being the first. And get this, Condoleezza Rice could be on the presidential ticket in 2008.
This. We have a black in the Supreme Court named Clarence Thomas. Condoleezza Rice in those positions has led us into an immoral, unethical war. Should we be proud of that? And if we should, then why aren't we proud of Clarence Thomas for doing everything but vote us back into slavery?
In terms of the war, I suppose history will certainly tell whether or not the war was the right thing to do. I think in the mind, with regards to the way a number of people feel that it's important for us to be there given what's going on in the Middle East.
But we didn't go there because of the Middle East.
Well, terror.
No, we went there because we were in imminent danger of weapons of mass destruction.
Yes,
and we're not there.
Well, we don't know. They didn't find them. It doesn't mean they weren't there.
No, they say they're not there, man.
They've admitted they're not there.
They say they're not there. Bush said they're not there. Yeah.
The president said that we haven't found them.
Bush couldn't find a hurricane in Louisiana, so I know you're not looking for Bush to find weapons.
No, the UN inspectors. The UN inspectors.
There is some validity when the black conservatives, for lack of a better term, attack some of us for saying don't play the race card.
Right.
But isn't it also the race card to tell us to be proud of a black just because they're black, but their policies may be wrong?
People make mistakes who are black and white. I mean, Colin Powell got on national television and said, you know what, one of the darkest moments in my term as Secretary of State was when I delivered that speech to the United Nations with faulty information.
Because he lied, just like Bill Clinton lied.
He got
lying is lying.
He said he got bad information, and he said he's sorry about it.
He can't go with that. He's the boss. The boss asked the guy, I know you're saying that, there's this gas, but could it possibly be anything else? He's too smart not to ask that question. So if he didn't ask it, he's lying. If he did ask it, they told him, and he's lying.
Man. Have you ever made a mistake?
Whether or not I've ever made a mistake doesn't mean that he wasn't lying.
Well, I worked in the White House. I know that you rely on the people who work for you. The president relied on the information that I brought him. Yeah. That was right and good information.
But he's still responsible for it.
Yes, ultimately he's responsible.
But he has to question your information.
But we did not go into Iraq because Bush made a mistake. No. Both parties, I mean, one of the reasons why John Kerry lost so hugely was because he was running a campaign as a Democrat saying, I'm not Bush, while supporting everything that Bush stood for, including the war. And at the Democratic Party convention, delegates to the tune of 85, 95% were anti-war, and they voted for him anyway because what the Democratic and Republican parties have become are places where people work to preserve the party.
The Democratic convention don't criticize Bush or the war. 2008. Presidential election again. Let's just hypothesize. Falani's already cutting her eyes. If we end up with a ticket, Hillary Clinton and Warner, former governor of Virginia, and John McCain and Condoleezza Rice on the Republican side, black America's interests is served best by who?